Hello, lovelies. Politics update. Let's piss off a few more of you, shall we? We've just had the European elections, and the far right has done quite well, sadly. Some of you will think that's a good thing, despite it happening in Germany as well, and on the 80th anniversary of D-Day, no less. So the big question is, why? And why is the UK moving leftward while mainland Europe is moving rightward, considering we were part of them until relatively recently, and we've actually had a worse time of it since leaving the EU? Maybe that's what it is, actually. Maybe the fact that Europe has been run relatively competently compared to the UK has made people look to the right about the hardships they are facing. I mean, the cost of living crisis and everything is global, rather than here, where we already had a far-right government, and so people are looking for solutions on the left. And when things are difficult, people do tend to look more to the extremes, but somehow that's just not in the British character quite so much, I don't think. I mean, it is amongst some people, but with the British people as a whole, perhaps not. I think a large part of it is that the actual left has largely quit the field, right? We don't hear a lot of left-wing economic arguments, even though a lot of them are no-brainers. In order to become electable, any left-wing party seems to have to cant to the centre, especially here in the UK as well, more so than in Europe. But basically, the actual left has largely quit the field and stopped making the arguments, and the pseudo-left, the woke scold group, whatever, they are obsessed with things that don't really matter, that don't make a material difference to most people's lives, and they just come across as scolds, hence the name. None of them will even have the argument when it comes to immigration or taxation or public services or anything like that. They're obsessed with identity politics, and the actual left gets pushed out by the centre left. So nobody is presenting the economic arguments or the positive arguments when it comes to immigration and taxation. And on everything else, the left, even though I still contend that it's not really the left, publicly facing, is a bunch of assholes who make everyone's life more difficult rather than easier, which is the actual aim, largely, of the left. The neoliberal consensus has held sway for such a long time that neoliberal economics and so on is taken as a sort of immutable orthodoxy in most parts, despite the fact that we know what actually works, and it's not that. We know what works to address the social issues that we face in this country and others, and we see it practiced in the Nordic countries to one extent or another and elsewhere in the world. Yet in a lot of the countries in Europe and here in the UK, the right has essentially had free rein to blame immigrants, the disabled, the unemployed, all the usual sort of targets that they go after, sexual deviance and all that. And it has suddenly become more socially acceptable to blame the Jews for everything as well. That doesn't help. Speaking of sexual deviancy, it's still Pride Month, so there's my contribution, even though it's heterosexual. History repeats as tragedy and then farce, right, according to Marx. So where does TikTok fascism and EDM remixes of Remove Kebab and Ausländer Raus fall? I'm guessing farce. Basically, it turns out that harassing people over unimportant, immaterial bullshit and just screaming racist at people and shutting down the debate instead of having the debate isn't as effective as discussing the issue, explaining and making the positive case for something. Not that it isn't, understandable that sometimes people feel that they can't have the debate. It can be draining. Countering bullshit takes much longer than spewing bullshit, and your righties are exhausting and pig-headed and disturbingly capable of ignoring reality for people who say, quite rightly, that facts don't care about feelings. Unfortunately, you let your feelings determine which facts you take on board. I mean, take, for example, the $2 trillion hole that Trump blew in the US economy with his tax breaks for the already wealthy, in the idea that this would somehow stimulate the US economy to such a degree that all the money would come back in about 10 years. I mean, it's just counting. It hasn't done that. It won't do that, and it's left US finances in a bit of a pickle. And the tax breaks for the truly wealthy don't have a cut-off date, but the tax breaks for what's left of the American middle class does. I think it was set at 5 years. There's also a claim going around in my comments that Trump invested $2 trillion in infrastructure, which isn't true. There were negotiations with the Democrats, and I think it ended up at somewhere around $200 billion, but not another $2 trillion. And arguing that when he'd already blown a $2 trillion hole in the economy is worrisome. But at least when it comes to infrastructure, people benefit, and the economy actually benefits. It's a material change. What he did do, however, was to use the promise of an infrastructure deal to try and browbeat Congress into his own pointless replacement for NAFTA, to stop investigating his corruption, and to remove the threat of impeachment. And he wanted to, in typical scattershot, senile, racist Facebook grandpa manner, limit what kind of things in terms of infrastructure that could be invested in, avoiding things like climate mitigation, renewables, things like that. So in the end, he ended up using this basically the same way he contributed to the Ukraine war happening, by threatening to withhold support for Ukraine, using money as a club. So, fuck that guy. But enough on that, because you're touchy and resistant to facts, so let's move over to some UK election specifics. We have a first-past-the-post system. We elect MPs in local constituencies of roughly the same population size, but often fiddled a bit to give the ruling party an advantage when it comes to boundary changes. However, MPs are all, unfortunately, members of a party, and so for a lot of MPs, the supposed local representation that they are meant to give us isn't really a thing. Because if your local issues come into conflict with your party demands and issues, the tendency is to go with the party in any case. And, an MP is only ever a representative of one when it comes to local issues. So, yeah, it's a bit of a problem. And that's why there's such a groundswell of support recently across the British public and parties outside of the big two for electoral reform of some kind, to more of a proportional representation system. See, the problem with first past the post is if locally your candidate loses, all the votes from anybody involved who didn't win are just essentially thrown away. So this is why we get parties with minority support from the population, but still having a large majority in Parliament and running government. And this doesn't change because any party that gets into power got into power because of the way that system works. So why would they then change it and disadvantage themselves moving forward? Generally, Labour will sometimes flirt with proportional representation when they've been out of power for a long time, but then when things swing and people get sick of the Conservatives and they sweep in, with a proper majority government, then suddenly, no, maybe we won't do that because, our majority depends on having a first-past-the-post system, even if it's unrepresentative. And the Tories just want an unrepresentative system that favours them anyway, which is first-past-the-post. So that drives a lot of tactical voting. StopTheTories.vote. Where you don't vote for who you want, but you vote against the party that you really don't want. So in this case, most people don't want the Conservatives, so they will look at who came second last election and probably vote for them in the hopes of kicking out the Conservatives or keeping out the Conservatives. And that helps create this false sense of consent as well if another party like Labour gets in. If they've benefited enormously from tactical voting, they take that as approval of their agenda, but what it actually is a rejection of the other party's agenda. But that's pretty much the best you can hope for, unfortunately. Turnout this year is likely to be low and driven in large part by massive anti-Tory sentiment. Tories are likely to stay home and not vote rather than come in and support them. So it's a kind of protest by not voting, I think. Further right beliefs are in a bit of a minority here, but it's a significant, unfortunately, minority. It's weird in that the Conservatives, despite being the furthest right they've been at any time I can remember since Thatcher, and being squeezed from the centre-left and the far right at the same time, as well as having turned off the centre-right, the Conservatives who retain a vestigial conscience. That's basically the problem that they've created for themselves. They will never be far right enough for the true far right, and in chasing the far right, they have alienated the centre ground, amongst other things. The campaign itself has been a disaster for the Conservatives since the start. It began with Rishi melting in the rain like the Wicked Witch, and it's just gotten worse since. There's no seeming organisation to their campaign, and everything they promise rings hollow. They apparently have all these brilliant ideas in their manifesto to turn the country around, but much of it comes down to the same radical, small L libertarian nonsense that Liz Truss wrecked the economy with before she was ousted. I guess when all you have is disaster capitalism and self-enrichment, everything looks like an opportunity, and that's all you can do. Besides, they've been in power for 14 years at this point. If they had all these brilliant, wonderful ideas and the majority in the Commons to do them, why didn't they? They've also committed other errors and gaffes. Rishi seems to be running his campaign without a competent comms team, and Conservative MPs are retiring and stepping away at such a rate of knots that the Conservatives may not be able to field a candidate in every seat. And that's compounded by the fact that the election caught everyone by surprise, including Sunak's own party, the Conservatives. Perhaps the biggest campaign disasters have been Sunak trying to say that Labour will raise everyone's taxes, and dodgily claiming that was confirmed by independent assessors at the Treasury that came to that conclusion. They didn't. They've published a letter saying the Treasury does not interfere in elections, and this is wrong for them to claim this. And this attack is, despite the Tories presiding over just about the biggest peacetime tax hike in UK history, but with absolutely fuck all to show for it. They have not reinvested it in the country. What they've done is they've placed most of the strain of that on the working and middle classes and have left the wealthy and the super rich, read Tory donors largely, off the hook. despite COVID and war profiteering by those same donors, it's corrupt all the way down, and mendacity now seems to be the chosen conservative way. Then there was the D-Day thing. So we mentioned D-Day earlier. It's a big deal in the UK. We are constantly drummed in with, our heroism during World War II and all the rest of it. Yeah, I have my own family stories about that sort of thing. I'm not jingoistic, but, I appreciate what my grandparents did during the war and everything. But yeah, it's kind of a no-brainer that if you're a British leader, you stay for all the D-Day commemoration stuff. It's a big thing. Our veteran worship isn't quite as bad as it is in the United States, but it's still pretty bad. And Rishi decided to leave in the middle of the D-Day observations. This should be an obvious boon to the Conservatives that the election's happening on the 80th anniversary. It really pumps up the nationalism and it gets those sorts of people, puffed up and proud of themselves. And yet they fucked it in the most obvious and insulting way possible to veterans and that sort of nationalist, gung-ho conservative. So that should have been an easy win, and somehow they turned it into a horrendous fail, unfortunately. It's not all about the Conservatives, though. The Greens are losing their one long-standing MP, Caroline Lucas, and it remains to be seen if the increasing and obvious urgency of the climate debate will result in them getting that seat with a new candidate, or maybe another one or two other seats. It's possible. Proportional representation would help them. Then we have Reform, who are kind of the inheritors of the UK Independence Party and the whole Brexit movement. A bunch of corporatist lunatics who should be getting a kicking over the abject disaster that Brexit has been, but Brexit is weirdly absent from most of the conversation in this election. It's a third rail. The people who backed it refuse to back down, even though it's obvious it's a total failure and we need to realign with the European Union. And nobody else dares bring it up for fear that it will somehow nix their electoral chances. Maybe next time around, opinions will have shifted far enough for an out-and-out pro-European party to do well, other than the Liberal Democrats. But they're making up ground for making the mistake of getting into bed with the Tories in the first place. The Reform has been its usual slow-rolling disaster of gaffes, with racist and xenophobic candidates being outed as having repugnant views. But their base doesn't give a fig about that. And they're still unlikely to end up with any MPs, despite their support pretty much being right neck and neck with the Conservatives at this point. That's how the system works, unfortunately. They're probably not going to end up with many MPs. Maybe they'll get one, unless any of the Conservatives who keep their seats, which isn't likely to be that many, decide to defect to Reform. I mean, Reform isn't even a political party, it's a company, which is how they just wedged Nigel Farage back in without having any kind of vote or democratic process whatsoever. Why anyone would vote for these clowns, who are just the Conservatives dialed up to 11, especially as a rejection of the Conservatives, I don't know. Some people are saying, oh, I'll either vote Labour or Reform. Which way, Western man? Or what is going on here? Why would you vote for the Conservatives only worse and your alternative be Labour? It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I don't know. Their support seems to be the same sort of low information voter base that seems to love Trump in the US. Idiots voting against their own interests because the gobshite on the telly hates the same people they do, or at least hints at it. There's definitely a gap in the political market in a lot of Anglo countries, not just the UK, for something that is economically left-wing but socially conservative. Something like that might be able to compete with Reform, or do away with them even. But I don't think that's a terribly good idea, even, because that social conservatism tends to lead to other problems later on. But I do think there's a gap in the market there. Meanwhile, this presentable version of the far right is making hay, playing up to that same demographic social conservatism while threatening to utterly dick them over economically and politically. Reform, for example, seems to want to not even so stealthy, but privatise the NHS, which is a really expensive, terrible idea which will lead to awful outcomes for the poor and working class. But hey, at least they hate foreigners. So Labour does seem to be headed for a thumping majority, but they're not without their own issues. The taxation attack that Sunak is using on them is an old attack that's always used against leftish parties. So it still has some power despite being exposed as a lie. Most people won't even care whether it's a lie or not. They'll just go along with it. Labour should be advocating, probably, for keeping high taxes but using the money usefully to acquire national assets and to invest in society. But they're too timid and afraid of somehow fucking this up and throwing the election to do that. Similarly, they've moved right on immigration, even though it's an economic necessity that any party is going to have to face up to at some point. And they all claim they want to improve the economic situation, and you basically can't do that without immigration. It's just the way it is. It's just economic gravity at this point. They've also been purging a lot of the Corbynite left from the party, starting with Corbyn himself. It does appear to be an electoral necessity because the British public seems to be small c conservative a lot of the time. Didn't used to be like this. Maybe once the right-wing media loses its stranglehold, that will finally change, but it doesn't look like it's changed just yet. Yeah, so it's an electoral necessity if Labour want to get in to do this, but it is a shame because we need a more left-wing party in power, but it's just not an electable proposition. So we're likely to get stuck with a milquetoast centre-left Labour government, and after they don't do much of what's really necessary and just kind of fiddle around the edges, it seems fairly likely that a resurgent right will come to power in 5 to 10 years, unless something fundamentally changes or they become a bit more daring. I mean, we can all hope. They've also been taking a lot of flack over an MP called Diane Abbott in particular. She was a left-wing Labour MP under Jeremy Corbyn. A bit of a trailblazer in Parliament as the first black female MP, and I think the first single mother in Parliament. But unfortunately, she's quite racist herself. And she bought into the idea that black people can't be racist. I agree with the new Labour that you can't really have overt racists associated with the party. It's a shame, she's fucked her legacy, but we can't allow racism in one instance and not in another. So, yeah, I agree with whatever sanctions she's taken. I think she's still running at this point, but there was a lot of confusion over it, and she is a figure of hate for the right. So here's my prediction for what it's worth. Labour get in with a sizable majority. The Conservatives are virtually annihilated, maybe even being pushed into third place in vote share, if not in MPs. Yeah, a boy can dream. The Conservatives in political exile lurch further to the right, and Reform continues to pick up steam. The right-wing press screams like Billy O about anything, however timid, that Labour does to try and address our numerous issues. And in part because of that, Labour fails to make the drastic changes and bold policy shifts that we actually need to address the underlying issues of the country. And most particularly, they probably quash any hope of electoral reform. They might perhaps tinker and fiddle a bit with the House of Lords, but probably not. Then in 5 to 10 years, once the right wing has sorted itself out again and buried the hatchet between its various factions, they probably resurge and then we're all fucked. So yeah, fun times ahead. It's been called misogynistic, racist, a hate group, reactionary. It's been blamed for Trump, for keeping women out of games and technology. None of this is true. If you want the real story, then you need to buy Inside Gamergate.